In the previous lesson, we talked about me, my history, some of the things I've made, how I got into creativity. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about some of my influences. And I bring up my influences not because these are influences that are holy grails that you have to know, that anyone has to know. But really what I want to show you is a little bit of a technique of how to dissect the things you like and how to really take things away from it that can inform your process of making things. And once you understand the things that you are gravitating towards, the things that have really made an impact on you, it helps you to understand work that exists in the world and also just how to make things yourself that get close to those things that you already like. We'll start off with one of my favorite film directors, Quentin Tarantino. He doesn't really need much of an introduction. Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill, Inglourious Basterds, Django Unchained, the list goes on and on. He's made plenty of great movies. The first thing that I find particularly interesting is that his use of pastiche. And what pastiche word it means is just a fancy French word for bringing things together and collaging them together and making something new out of it. And so when you watch Quentin Tarantino's movies, you'll notice that he is constantly drawing references from existing movies, from all different types of genres and countries, time periods, everything. He is unafraid to steal things from other people. There's an old saying that good artists copy and great artists steal. The more you make things, the more you will understand that saying. And really what that is that you should steal things in part. You should not steal someone's entire idea and just pass it off as your own. That makes you a very bad artist. But what you should do is you should take things and executions and little bits of other people's work and put it into your work and mix it all together to create something that surpasses or is very different from the thing that you're stealing from. Tarantino loves to use pastiche. You can literally go on YouTube right now and put in Quentin Tarantino references and you'll find tons of videos that show you frame by frame how he pulled things from different filmmakers throughout the history of cinema. The next thing that I take from Tarantino is his use of insight. When you watch Quentin Tarantino movies, he's very well known for his dialogue and how people talk, and he'll have very long dialogue scenes that feel very cool and back and forth, and people just say crazy things that become very memorable. And really when you dissect that dialogue, a lot of what the scenes that we grab onto where we're like, wow, this guy really came up with something that was crazy, it is built on insight. He is clearly a very insightful person. People who are writers tend to be insightful. They have to pay attention to the world and notice things and be able to put those things into their work. And so Tarantino makes all of his characters just as insightful as he is. A great example of this is in Pulp Fiction with the Royale with cheese scene. And in that scene, you have two hitmen driving in a car. One of them has recently returned from Europe. And he tells his friend about how fast food is different in Europe. And while that may seem like a very throwaway thing, it became a very memorable scene because this man is talking about how in Europe, quarter pounder with cheese is not called a quarter pounder with cheese because they have the metric system. It is instead called a Royale with cheese. That is an insight. The insight that in Europe, some of the things that we know and love are slightly different because of different cultural contexts. You should be able to do those sorts of things in your writing, in your work. We will talk about insight in great depth later, but this is something I've picked up from Quentin Tarantino. The last thing that I've picked up from him is his ability to be unafraid in how he tells a story. He is very willing to play with time in how he tells stories. If you remember, Pulp Fiction is chronologically all out of order. He will bring in different sort of mediums. In Kill Bill, he brought in anime in the middle of his story to sort of tell a backstory there in a very creative way. This is something that I greatly admire and something that really can take a very old idea and make it feel new if you're willing to tell the story in a totally new way. That is something that I think we all as storytellers, as creative people should aspire to, is to tell our stories in new and exciting ways. The next artist who I take a lot of influence from is a Scottish writer named Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison is a very prolific comic book writer with a long and illustrious career, and they have worked on characters for Marvel, DC. They have characters that have become television shows, movies, all of the like. The thing that I have taken away from Grant Morrison is the idea of being able to sneak very personal ideas into very commercial work. So Morrison has written Superman, Batman, the X-Men, all of the giant comic book characters that you could imagine. At the same time, they have also been able to put in ideas that are very esoteric and very niche into these characters. When they were writing a comic book called Animal Man in the late 80s and early 90s, they were able to put in the idea of animal rights activism into a comic book that was being published by DC Comics. Animal rights activism, obviously not a new concept, but to think that in a superhero comic books where, guys punching other guys in spandex, that there could be diversions about the plight of animals and how we should all stop eating meat and how we should respect animals. That was a very new idea and a very personal idea to Grant Morrison, who is a vegan and an animal rights activist, snuck into something very wide and mainstream. Also, in the comic book Doom Patrol, which was written in the early 90s, Morrison was able to sneak in the non-binary experience. The way that they did that was with a character called Danny the Street, which is a sentient street, is populated by very masculine stores, gun stores, hardware stores, things like that, but they're all decorated in a very sort of feminine way. And so while this idea seems very esoteric and very sort of out there, and maybe a lot of people did not necessarily fully get it in 1992 or whatever, but it was still Morrison putting in their very personal experience as a non-binary person into their work and disseminating it to millions of people who would read these comic books over the years. So that idea of being able to put who you are and your experience into things that you're making commercially is definitely one of the things that I take away from Grant Morrison. Morrison also does a really great job of interrogating long-held ideas. When you're working with characters as big as Superman, which is, you can't think of an idea that is more well-known and very understood. But when you're working with characters like that, and then you're able to subvert them or bring new spins to them, that is, again, something that we should all aspire to be able to bring a new take to an old idea, to an old worn thing. And so like with Superman, Morrison wrote a very famous comic book, All-Star Superman, which posited Superman almost as a messianic figure. The idea of Superman, of hope, of strength, and of selflessness as something that we should all aspire to. And obviously Superman has been around for 70-some, 80-some years, but the way that he approached the comic and the character as hope incarnate, as something that could relieve us of all of our ills and stresses and worries, was a very new take on a character we've known for so many years as a strong man in spandex who punches aliens and flies around the world. Lastly, Grant Morrison is a very exciting writer because they're always willing to bring very big ideas into their work. What I mean by that is that in The Invisibles, which is another comic book that Morrison has written, they brought in the idea of the occult into superhero comics. They brought a lot of metatextual aspects into it. In Animal Man, Morrison wrote themselves into the comic book, which, sorry for spoiling a comic book that is 30 years old at this point, but I'm gonna do it anyway. At the end of the comic book, Animal Man has felt in a weird presence, felt like someone's watching him, and he goes and finds the person who's watching him, and it turns out to be Grant Morrison, and they have a conversation about how Grant Morrison is authoring his life at the very moment. Which, again, this is very heady stuff for a comic book in 1992. The thing we take away from this is do not be afraid to bring big ideas. There is no execution, there is no thing that is too small for you to try to bring the biggest idea possible into that and make that work bigger and reach more than what it has already been. The next artist that I draw a lot of inspiration from are the graphic designers Hypnosis. They were record designers during the 70s, 80s, and worked a lot with artists like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Black Sabbath, etc., etc. In the age before Photoshop, all of us who have Photoshop can manipulate an image in 8 million ways and create any sort of crazy image we want to. Hypnosis, we're creating images that still to this day just look insane and just crazy. And I think the thing that I really take from them is their persistence and their sort of DIY sort of approach to things. Again, they existed before Photoshop, but yet they were able to create images. And when you look through articles with them and interviews with them, they talk about the process and the sort of ingenuity that they would display to create these images that even now with Photoshop, you're still like, how exactly did you do that? I really love that approach of, I see something in my head and I'm gonna stop at nothing to make that thing that I see in my head a reality. I also really enjoy the work of hypnosis because it is all very surreal and it's all very dreamlike. And they were constantly pushing these images that just felt like they were ripped out of someone's dream, out of someone's subconscious. And again, I think as an artist, you should always be trying to push for something that is new, something that has never been seen before, something that could not easily be replicated. We don't always hit that, but that should always be the mark that we're aiming for, is to make something that stands the test of time because it's so unique, it is so one of a kind, as much of the work of hypnosis is. I really love this image that they made for this band called Deceptive Bends. It's just like so evocative and just beautifully made, but also doesn't really make any sense. Why is this sea diver pulling this woman out of fire? Like, what is happening here? We don't really know, but it's just the sort of thing that just you want to look at and figure out what the story is behind it. And again, you know, I spoke about how it's great to make things that make people feel things, you know, and like you look at this image and it draws you in and you feel something. It's sort of a question of mystery of like what's happening, but just the colors and the composition and all of it is just super evocative and really makes you want to figure out what world this came from. And so like there's this image for this Peter Gabriel album cover. You look at this image and it just looks so like weird how the picture is melting. And I have never listened to this album, but it feels like this man is tortured a bit, you know, that he is like reckoning with himself and maybe like the darker parts of himself. And this was made before Photoshop. This is really easy to do in Photoshop now in 2021, but this album cover was made in the 70s. You know, you're like, well, how exactly did they do this? Like, how much time did it take to, you know, make his face melt on just one side? And it's melting just a little bit on the other side. And then when you go to the back cover, his face is totally fine, but the back cover is melting. And then when you read the interviews with them, you figure out that they had figured out a way to use Polaroid here. And that if you took a picture on a Polaroid, but before it actually set, you started to like scrape on it and stuff, you could get this sort of melting effect. That's just like ingenuity and just like playing around with stuff and just finding a way to make the image that you see in your head reality and come to life. And that's something that we should all, you know, take influence from. The last artist that I take a lot of inspiration from is a director named Khalil Joseph. He is a director of music videos primarily. He also does like art video installation for museums and the such. And the thing that I really like about his work is that it's very evocative, it's very dreamlike, but it is also very specifically tailored to his experiences and bringing out the very specific in his work. And I think that's something that we should all, as artists, aspire to, is to put ourselves into the work as much as possible. And again, this is someone who's creating music videos for Beyonce, music videos for other artists who have their story, they're telling their worldview. But Khalil is able to work with them and collaborate and to bring Beyonce's vision to life, but also bring a part of him into it. I really turned to a piece he did for Kendrick Lamar. That was a video called Good Kid, Mad City, and it was about 15, 16 minutes long. And it's just this really dreamlike, very heavily edited sort of film that gives you a sense of place. Kendrick Lamar grew up in Compton, and this video takes you through Compton in all of its phases, both from little kids hanging out, playing and running around and, just living life, to people getting shot and going to funerals and parties and violence, and all of the things that make up the Compton that Kendrick Lamar raps about are present in Khalil Joseph's footage. And the thing about his footage that is beautiful is the way that he often eschews logic. As we create things, we pick up rules about how things should be created. And often those rules are there for a good reason. They help us make things very clear. They help us stay away from unconscious mistakes. But Khalil is often willing to break those rules and come up with things that feel right, but aren't necessarily technically right, or they're technically very experimental, let's just say. And that is something that I've definitely always tried to bring into my work, a full knowledge of the rules of the medium that I'm working in, but at the same time, sometimes you gotta break the rules and do something that just feels right. And that's something that we all should aspire to. In the next lesson, I'll talk to you about how you establish the brief.